I thought I had a tricky job because I was told, come and talk 15 minutes about the Byzantine Empire covering 1,000 years or 1,100 years. I think yours is going to do 2,000 years after me, so you're going to get value for money. So I'm going to talk very fast. It's going to be, okay, buckle up. I've also got too many slides. Right. The Byzantine Empire, the good news is, and I have 2 or 3 extremely distinguished colleagues here, but for most people, no one knows anything about the Byzantine Empire. And I will prove that. So unless you're Professor of Late Antiquity at Cambridge or Ali Ansari, if you can tell me the difference of any of these people, you get a prize, right? They're all reasonably famous. Constantine must be important somewhere. Probably the first one, you go, yes, Constantine the Great. Then the second paragraph is a little bit thin. And this is a game you can keep on playing. If you see what I mean. So the Byzantines cover 1,000 years. They don't mean much to most people. When they do, and you think about what the Byzantines are, typically you get Justinian and Theodora because they make great Netflix material, right? Because Theodora was supposedly a very spicy woman with a fruity background, did lots of things that if I had more time I would tell you about. But why she's important, why Justinian are important, again, most people in a very distinguished room like this don't really know or really care. It's a long time ago anyway. You think about the Byzantine Empire, name the great city of Constantinople, modern Istanbul, that's fine. If you were to ask what was the second or the third or the fourth most important city in the empire, people start to scratch their heads. And that's partly because the empire's borders change over this 1,000-year period. But we are familiar with the Byzantines, but we are not interested, by and large. This is the Church of the Holy Apostles, reconstruction, palaces, etc., the great hippodrome that was the kind of Wembley Stadium of its day, with this extraordinary lineup of monuments showing the military prowess of the Roman Empire. There you go, I'll keep on going. Right, no one likes Byzantium. This is Voltaire. A worthless collection of declamations and miracles, a disgrace for the human mind. And one of the questions is Voltaire right? Sometimes people have strong opinions. Voltaire is in a pretty distinguished company. Byzantine history of Saints' Lives, says Gibbon, extravagant tales which display the fiction without the genius of poetry. That's not great if you're a young graduate student. Hegel, very, disgusting picture of imbecility, wretched, insane passions. So people don't know about the Byzantine world, but they have opinions. Hegel, you can read this while I keep talking. It's about intrigues. It's about plots. It's about assassinations and poisonings. It's about self-indulgent politics. It's not about success. It's not about stability. It's not about achievements. And I think that's extremely interesting, this long legacy of the Byzantine world. If I came another time, I maybe try and talk about why these negative perceptions have been carried on for so long. So here, this was mentioned last week. I found this morning. The word Byzantine is itself extremely pejorative. This is to do with AI, or earlier this year, this is the Byzantine rules. There's somebody in Parliament talking about legalizing of cannabis. How the Byzantines somehow are part of this conversation and a negative part, it's very interesting. So it's lovely to be here to try to explain why this stuff was interesting or important. The Byzantine trap. The Byzantines, when they had enemies at the gate, had the enemy at the gate, were arguing about the gender of angels. I can promise you that is not true. And I can promise you that the distinguished member of the House of Lords does not know what he's talking about. But because I'm very polite, I don't like to name people when they make idiotic comments because I think we should still behave as a gentleman, even if you're a scholar. Right. The rise and fall. Right, the rise is easy, right? You all know the story of the rise because it's the story of Rome. It's the story of the Republic, followed by the transition into what is sort of a loosely thought of as an empire under the Emperor Augustus, but becomes a proper empire during his reign and that of his successors. One of the great unifying military, political, economic machines in history, then not just of antiquity, that covers, roughly speaking, this land here. It's the only empire to have been trans-Mediterranean, covering the whole basket of these shorelines into a single entity and single unit. And I don't need to explain why or how, that's another time. But by around about the 4th century, this is too big. It's a big administrative unit to run things efficiently. Like the Axel Johnson Foundation, you need to find talented people who are committed to run things for you. And they're not always easy to find. They tend to do the good job. Success breeds success. So institutional sophistication, and when the wheels of the machine work, you can explain how those should keep working. Once things sit in place, but it becomes a big entity. And one of the challenges is that, as you can see from my map, there are no Roman threats to the west of the Iberian Peninsula because that's the Atlantic Ocean. You have the Sahara Desert underneath this littoral strip. There are always people who always cause problems, whether in today's world or in the past. You've of course got the Goths, no disrespect, who the latest research suggests that they also like having showers and saunas rather than beating each other up. They're very sophisticated. That's the latest ideas about the Germanic peoples. But the real money is in the east. And I mean that literally, because there's the networks of silk roads, of trade, of exotica, of metals, of spices, and so on. So at the beginning of the 4th century or so, the Emperor Constantine, number one, the one everyone has heard of, builds a new city on the site of Byzantium, at the meeting of the Hellespont, on the Bosphorus, which all of you know because you're all interested in classics. This means, the Bosphorus means Oxford, of course, the place where the oxes cross over the side. It's our sister city, obviously. And this city soon becomes nicknamed, it gets called New Rome and soon gets nicknamed Constantinople, the city of Constantine. It would today be called sort of Trumpopolis or something like that. Lots of people like to commemorate their legacies. And this becomes a dual center of gravity, and there's a lot of discussion about, is it exactly parallel to Rome? How's the relationship between? But broadly speaking, Rome gets divided up, not just at administrative level, but between the imperial structure at the top. So you have more or less an east and a western ruler at a certain point in time. Eventually, there starts to be pressure from the Germanic peoples, from the Huns, partly to do with climatic changes. I don't really like maps because they're very crude. They don't show you how people move or what rivers or mountains and so on there are. But from the late 4th century onwards, there starts to be a sequence of mounting pressures of Goths. One of the emperors, Valens, is defeated at Adrianople in what's now Turkey, Edirne, in European Turkey in 378. And then after that, you have Attila and his sons. This is the best image I could find of Attila from Attila Total War. And that compromises the Western provinces. Those infrastructures, those support networks, it's not just about violence. We heard Hugh yesterday talk about the importance of how time can dissolve structures. And something like that happens in the West. There's breakdowns of communication networks, breakdowns of infrastructure investment. People start to become much more insular in their communities, in the ways in which they travel, they receive information. And that sort of sag brings things down over time to more or less the decline of the Western provinces. And there are a few pockets of inspiration, but more or less from about 400 until, well, let's say the Norman Conquest, because that's a date that means something to us in England. For the next 600-700 years, Western Europe, people don't build in stone anymore. Literacy more or less collapses outside the church, and it's quite frankly shit. The eastern provinces, on the other hand, keep blossoming, partly because they are more densely populated with cities. Urban societies encourage trade, encourage those institutions to function and work. And over the next 1,000 years, we see the empire have its fortunes and its misfortunes. Here, one of its sort of peak moments. I say peak. This is the Emperor Justinian, the one married to Theodora. This comes in the decade after the Justinianic plague that Peter Saris has written about with such distinction, where there's depopulation. And depopulation, of course, makes infrastructure and institutions harder because there are fewer people, competences change, etc. But territorially, this is a sort of peak in the 500s-600s. By the 11th century, there are sort of ebbs and flows. This is at the death of my favouritely named Byzantine Emperor Basil the Bulgar Slayer, with respect to anybody who is Bulgarian or has Bulgarian heritage. That's again another Trump nod. Where the sort of heartlands, always centred on Constantinople, is what matters. Over the coming centuries, the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, very famous. It's the day still in Turkish history that's seen by Erdogan and used as a political rallying point to gather all Turks of all nations and so on. By 1204, as Simon Mayle said yesterday, the Crusaders go rogue. They've over-borrowed to do a campaign against, notionally to get to Jerusalem. They end up sacking Constantinople and installing what anybody would do if you sack a great empire is you put the Belgians in charge. So there are Flemishness with respect to Christine. How important it is, so there are Flemish Western rulers of the Byzantine Empire for about 50 years or so. By 1261, the Byzantines, or the Romans as they call themselves, I should be very clear about that, Romans, recover the throne and keep going. Most historians, when they talk about it, say, well, it's all pretty sad after 1204. The Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, keeps going for another 250 years, which is not bad. That takes us, for example, back beyond Gustav Vasa here, so it's quite a long time. So things work. 1453, the kind of cut-off point when the Ottoman Turks capture the city. There we go. Those legacies of the empire are extraordinarily important. This is Venice, classic Byzantine model church on the Holy Sepulchre. Church of Holy Apostles. Damascus, Amalfi. Here, you guys in Scandinavia, huge legacy to structures and things that are learnt from the Byzantine Empire. Here, the Church of St. Sophia in Kyiv, thank God, still standing. Those legacies are because the borrowings from this world, urbanized, sophisticated, wealthy, stable, are very attractive to people. So this looks very different to those comments by Voltaire, Hegel, and members of Parliament in Britain and everywhere else, that the admiration, the emulation, the wanting to borrow from the structures that are Roman or Byzantine are extremely intensive. So I've got 2.5 minutes. I've got 3 minutes to try to pick out from this big sweeping view what are the secrets of the success. Because if we were to look at the Byzantine Empire and the whole, the Roman Empire and the whole, the first thing you'd want to understand is how is it so successful? It covers in all different periods, multi-ethnic, multi-regional, often multilingual, multi-faith. There are lots of different nationalities, particularly knocking around Constantinople. How does it manage to be so inclusive, so stable, despite the images of constant plots and so on? And there are, I suppose, a few things one can look at to explain that success. One is institutional integrities. So starting with law, for example, again, Peter Saris on Justinian's Codex, the ways in which the mechanics of law and justice work are essential to anything to be able to operate successfully. And that has lots of mirrors in different periods in time, not least our own, that if you can keep some form that justice is, roughly speaking, equal for everybody, then the show stays on the road. So that's a really important part, I think, of the success, institutions, not just in law, but the ways that the Byzantines gather information about other people and are responding to constant sets of crises. That location of Constantinople is great if you like to have afternoon tea watching the sunset, but as you can be a victim of your own success. Everybody wants something from this wealthy world. There are opportunities and challenges and lots of rivals trying to knock you off your spot. So having the sophistication of a bureaucracy that understands what's going on is key. Second, which often doesn't get talked about enough by many historians, is the nuts and bolts of logistics. The investment in infrastructure here, the network of aqueducts for Constantinople on its own, network and canals covering about 600 kilometers. Some of these aqueducts bringing water from Thrace 140 kilometers away to feed and supply cities. Requires technical skill, it requires engineering, and above all, it requires investment. Not just to build it, but also to be constantly taking away limescale, to be cleaning. And to know how to do that means training people and working out how to look after your kit. Third, this bottom left is my nod towards a sort of common, coherent view that everyone's in it together. In the Roman Empire, before Christianity, before Constantine, there's lots of different local beliefs. That does persist a bit in the Byzantine world, the later Eastern Roman world, but the envelope of Christianity provides a kind of common language, cultural language, a common intellectual language that allows a sense that people are together and that there's a sense of unity. Now, that, again, sounds very different to the plots and people trying to bring each other down, but there is a kind of overlapping idea that this is a world that is somehow coherent. Last two things I'd say, economic competence. We see the Byzantine coinage is also one of my favorite emperors, Constantine Porphyrogenitus, born in the purple, the room that reigning empresses gave birth to their to their progeny, managing gold supply, managing coinage, making sure people are able to trade, working out how to tax, at what level, that you can encourage, I don't want to say free trade or fair trade, but encourage velocities of exchange is important for any state, and the Byzantines do that very well. The last one up here, which has nothing to do with what I'm going to say, it's just a picture of a family. It's about the principles of inheritance, and above all, the regulation of elite wealth and elite status by the emperor. For all sorts of different reasons, Byzantine and Roman emperors are very good at spotting that there are dangers when society becomes overstratified. So it's very unusual in the world that I work on, the world we work on, to find families that are really powerful for more than 3 generations. That's partly because there's a constant recycling of wealth, and it has a very natural feed into the Ottoman world, where the distribution of assets across family members means that assets are constantly being given to new people. They're constantly being handed over. And that means that the structure seems to work for 1,000 years better than it does, let's say, under Putin or Trump. And I'll end on that line, because there's my trade routes, which is that model of the Byzantine world is extremely powerful in modern Moscow, which Moscow has seen itself as the third Rome since 1453. Maybe if we have a chance to talk about that in the questions, we go into that one more. But there we go. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Just a sec. Yeah, you'll be back shortly at the end here. But just a quick question. When you said that the negative attitudes, to put it that way, against Byzantium, they deserve a speech on their own. But what would the condensed version sound like?
Yeah, great question. So probably, let's say, 3 trigger points. First, as Europe starts to rise in the kind of early Middle Ages, the wealth, the urban setting of Constantinople, its magnificence, is extremely intimidating and very threatening. So Constantinople and the Roman world starts to be used as a mirror for people's hang-ups. That's one. Second, with the Crusades, there's a specific moment at the end of the 11th century where the First Crusade goes wrong, Simon Mayle mentioned yesterday, where a narrative of how do you explain that Westerners control Jerusalem and Antioch and eventually Constantinople means that the West is trying to take that legacy away, which is why the relabeling of Byzantine, which is never a word that's used by this empire. And in fact, in the West, we then start to talk about the Roman Empire, again, the Holy Roman Empire, the Pope being head of the church. So I think that comes during the period too. But then after the sack of Constantinople, and the fall, rather, to the Ottomans in 1453, Europe in the West has to find its own narrative. And in the worlds that we work on, the richest half of Europe was always the East. The connecting through to other networks, the emulations with the Sasanians or with the Safavids, the Ottomans. Western Europe rose because it managed to discover that there were new continents across the Atlantic. And when Columbus sailed across the Atlantic, he was trying to raise money for a campaign on Jerusalem. This big red cross on his flag was to show him as a modern crusader. The discovery of unlimited silver, at least for 200 years in South America, enriched Western Europe. So the story of the West was, how does Spain, Portugal, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Britain take that story of the fact that we are the heirs of Rome? And to become the heirs of Rome, you've got to denigrate everybody else. And that's a kind of, that's why history is important. Those layers makes it interesting.
Well, good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.